Okay, there we go. Welcome to this new book news reading, celebrating books published during the pandemic lockdown. My name is Karen Schubert, and I'm the director of Lit Youngstown, a literary arts nonprofit in Northeast Ohio for writers, readers, and storytellers. I would like to invite you to a reading Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time by poets Adam Hughes and Renee Sanders. More information at lityoungstown.org. Thank you for joining us. I'm so pleased to feature these three writers this evening, and congratulations to them on this book, incredible collection. We'll follow this evening's reading with a conversation. Kristen Lepionka is the author of the Columbus-based Roxane Weary Private Eye series and a two-time Shamus Award winner. She's also co-founder of the feminist podcast Unlikeable Female Characters and served as the president of the Midwest chapter of Mystery Writers of America. Welcome, Kristen.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. So this is from my short story, which is called Gun People. It turned out that Anya had zero aptitude for home improvement. The mess of it, the dry chemical stink, the 2,000 hexagonal shower tiles that had to be placed with such exhausting precision. It was nothing like the HGTV shows that she loved, edited as they were into palatable chunks. The real-life version was noisy and full of loose nails and cracked plaster, and even 3 months into the process, their beautiful ruin of a house still resembled a before photo of itself more than any kind of after. Her husband, calm, patient Eli, was in his element, his mathematical brain perfectly suited to tedious tasks. He reveled in a job well done, in straight lines and right angles. He was surprisingly adept with tools for a rangy, bookish accountant, but it had all been her idea, joining the ranks of the Old Townie gentrifiers, rescuing a condemned Queen Anne on Bryden Road, and restoring the house to its 19th century glory. Why had she ever thought this was a good plan? She was sick of it after the 2-month mark. The part that Anya was interested in, the selection of paint colors and furniture and the right style of curtains, was ages away. It embarrassed her that after all this, what she actually wanted was to go shopping. But by the time she realized it, what was there to do? Suggest they abandon everything and move back to the suburbs? Her friends had been telling her she'd made a mistake, a series of mistakes, really, and she wasn't about to prove them right. They'd met in the jewelry store where she worked after college, her fashion design degree collecting dust, when Eli came in to buy a gift for his niece. He wasn't her type. He was a good 10 years older than her, she guessed at the time. 15, it turned out, with tortoiseshell glasses and hair threaded with gray. But he radiated a calm, solid confidence that she found unexpectedly charming. He returned the next week to ask her to dinner. She liked that he didn't come in with a pretense, didn't ask her without actually asking the way men did sometimes. She fell for him fast, or maybe with the way he made her feel, with the version of her that he saw, sophisticated, smarter, more interesting than she really was. He didn't play games or make things unnecessarily complicated, and she always knew where she stood with him. And the sex was good. It was. So sometimes he could be a little too careful with her, like he was polishing a violin, and he was fast asleep by 10 o'clock most nights, and he subscribed to 3 different newspapers and read them all every day. But in the interest of finally deciding what kind of life she was going to lead, she could deal with that. He wanted her to have everything she wanted, and in that way they were perfect for each other. The problem was, she had never really known what she wanted herself. The trouble really started in February. She dropped a hammer on her right foot, fracturing 2 metatarsals. The doctor in the emergency room at Grant Hospital gave her the big blue shoe and said she was to avoid putting any weight on it for 6 to 8 weeks. That meant 6 to 8 weeks more in the half-done house, or longer. Tax season was ramping up for Eli, and longer hours at the office meant less progress anyway. And now this. She became slightly hysterical at the thought. Eli rubbed her back while she cried, the first time she had done so in his presence in the 2 years since they had been together. He said, "Listen, I know we said we wanted to do all the renovation work ourselves, but maybe we can bring in some contractors just to keep the ball rolling while you're laid up." Anya said, "You won't be disappointed?" Nah. He kissed her temple. He was so decent that it could irritate her a little. The important thing is we're in this together. That was her last chance, she realized after what happened, to tell him the truth. But instead she nodded and tucked her head into his shoulder. and just let him take care of things. Eli hired a crew called Well Built to take over. There were 4 of them, 2 college-aged kids always plugged into their headphones, a grizzled old guy who chewed tobacco like gum, and the foreman of the crew, Steve. The energy drinks they consumed each day left an alarming quantity of crushed cans in the trash, which Anya moved to the recycling bin each evening. She emptied the coffee mug they used as an ashtray. Otherwise, she avoided them. Sometimes she tried to amuse herself by sketching something, a dress she might wear to the open house. Once this nightmare was completed, but nothing came to her. There was a blank white square in the center of her imagination, like she'd stared directly at an eclipse. It was during a break while she was sketching that Steve knocked on her office door. "Excuse me, miss, the power's going to flick off for a minute here. Just wanted to let you know." As he spoke, the door ticked open slowly from the force of his knock. "Oh," he said, taking in the blue foam shoe. She'd been behind a sewing table the few times he'd seen her before. "Okay, thanks," she said. Steve stayed where he was and nodded at her foot. "Let me guess," he said. "It happened when you fell from heaven?" It was the most ridiculous thing anyone had ever said to her, and she laughed out loud, a harsh, sudden cackle that seemed to startle them both. Then she felt bad even as she struggled to keep from laughing again. "You nailed it." "Thought so," Steve said, doubling down instead of melting into the hallway from embarrassment. He was short, not much taller than Anya, but sturdy and muscular, his features almost entirely hidden under a baseball cap and behind a neat, dark beard. Then he winked, like maybe he was in on the joke after all, and pulled the door closed behind him. After that, he started stopping by her room to tell her something each day, that they were turning the boiler off for a while so it might get cold upstairs, they were ordering Jimmy John's for lunch, and did she want anything? It started to become a welcome distraction. Her friends would not come to visit her here, citing the street crime. Indeed, her college roommate Leslie had had her car broken into the one and only time she did venture into Old Town, but that was mostly her own fault for leaving an iPad sitting on the passenger seat in full view. A bad idea in any neighborhood. And sure, there were occasionally muttering strangers in the alley behind the house, and every so often a series of pops that might have been gunshots or a car backfiring. It was impossible to say. The area felt safe enough to Anya, though. No one had ever bothered her on the street. Not like when she lived in the short north and she was accosted at least twice a day by panhandlers. But she hadn't gone outside in a week. She wasn't allowed to drive yet, and the city was frozen in snowy gridlock, Bryden Road seemingly one of the last streets to get plowed. Eli had cleared their sidewalk, but the houses on either side of theirs had not. Where would she go? The porch? Eventually she tried it, bundled herself up in 2 coats and a quilt she had made in high school. "What on earth are you doing out here, hun?" Steve said when he found her there. "It's 15 degrees. Though he wore nothing but jeans and a t-shirt, and he didn't seem to be cold. "I needed a change of scenery, cabin fever. I've been stuck in there too long." He looked up at the house, its towering 3 stories. "Castle fever, more like. I'm actually going to run over to the Ace Hardware on Parsons, if you want to come, just to get out for a bit." Anya heard herself say, "That would be great." She was able to hobble down the steps on her crutches, but when it came to hoisting herself up into his massive truck, she required assistance, unable to stand on her right foot long enough to step up into the cab with her left, unable to do the opposite either. "Here," Steve said, "just here." He grabbed her by the hips and lifted her as easily as placing a dish on a shelf. Anya was a little shocked that he was that strong, that he touched her like that without asking if it was okay. He tucked her crutches into the back seat and slammed her door closed. The inside of the truck smelled of smoke and paint. She stared straight ahead as he got in and drove away from the house. Her face was hot, but she didn't know why. Then he said, "So how come your dad doesn't take you places?" Anya cringed. Oh God, this had been a mistake. "My dad? No, he's my husband." Steve raised an eyebrow. "How'd a guy like him land a fox like you?" This is inappropriate, I think. Had she encouraged him by letting him flirt with her out of boredom? Had she accidentally flirted back? "I'm just messing you," he said, with shooting her a wink. She waited in the truck while he went into the store, pressing her cold hands to her cheeks to cool them. She was embarrassed on his behalf, but also, just barely, she felt a tug of desire. Was this what happened when she spent too much time on her own? When they returned to the house, he hopped out first and came around to her side and scooped her up. "My crutches," she said. "Oh, right." Still balancing her against him, he reached easily into the back seat to grab them. Anya gasped when she felt a sudden hardness pressing into her thigh. "What? Oh my," she said, grateful when the crutches were in hand and she could step away from him. But then she saw what she'd felt, a gun, holstered to his hip, just the bottom of it sticking out from under his t-shirt, and some small part of her was disappointed. and she was ashamed and then profoundly intrigued. Steve saw her looking and lifted up the hem of the shirt. What did you think it was? I didn't, nothing. But why? Why do you have a gun? This isn't a good neighborhood, darling, he said. A bunch of rich people trying to fix up these old mansions doesn't change that. That night, eating Chinese takeout from the place on Broad Street, she asked Eli, have you ever fired a gun? He twirled a noodle around his chopsticks. I can't say that I have. Why? I was just wondering. He went back to the Wall Street Journal. I was wondering, Anya went on, if we should get a gun for in the house. Eli put his newspaper down in surprise. I don't think you and I are gun people, are we? Not for fun, Anya said, like for safety. Safety? He stared at her, eyes growing concern behind his glasses. You feel unsafe here? Well, no, she said. Eli said, a gun doesn't make anyone feel safer. No, never mind. I was just asking. I think a lot of people around here do have guns. What people? If anything, more guns means less safety, percentage-wise. He continued, but she tuned him out, realizing she didn't have the vocabulary for what she was trying to say. It was after 5 one day when Steve tapped on her office door and just stood there. The other members of the well-built crew were gone for the day. It had been a week since the awkward trip to the hardware store. He said, I've been thinking about you. That's nice. Have you been thinking about me? Steve, she said. In truth, she had been. His lack of self-awareness for how embarrassing their last conversation had been repelled her, but also drew her in. Ditto for the smell of him. Dust and smoke and sweat. Was there a word for that? A thing and its opposite? He stepped closer, touched the edge of her desk with his hands, rough, with perennially dirty nails. I'm going to kiss you. He wasn't asking, but she didn't say no. They screwed on her drafting table urgently, only removing the mandatory items of clothing. He was the opposite of Eli in every way, his body compact and rock hard with the kind of muscle that came from manual labor, not a gym, his chest blanketed with thick dark hair. He held her wrists above her head, both in one hand, the other hand clamped at her hip to keep her from sliding off the table. A lamp tipped onto the floor, the bulb shattering on impact, and sprayed their legs with fine shards of glass. As soon as it was over, she was repulsed again, by him, by herself, by the endless series of mistakes she seemed determined to keep making. Jesus, that was good, Steve said, patting her on the ass like she was a dressage horse. Whew, baby, baby. Please don't call me that. Anya buttoned her jeans, smoothed down her shirt. What had just happened? It already felt like it involved someone else entirely. Okay, Steve said, baby. Anthology, Eli said later, behind his newspaper, when a word has multiple meanings, including its own opposite. Anya probed a sliver of glass still lodged in the blue Velcro of her stupid foam shoe. Once she had teased it out, she pressed the point of it into her index finger until it bled. So that's from Gun People.
Thank you so much, Kristen.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yolonda Tonette Sanders is the author of the Protective Detective series, featuring Columbus homicide detective Troy Evans. She also runs Yo Productions, LLC, offering services to writers, founded Women's Weekend Writeaway, is a co-founder of the yearly Faith and Fellowship Book Festival, and is an editor for Urban Ministries, Incorporated. Please welcome Yolonda.
Thank you. So I am going to read from The Valley, which takes place in Whitehall. 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000. 9-year-old Kelly counted out the numbers, resting her head on her forearm as she leaned against the tree while her friends and brother found their hiding spots. Though her eyes were supposed to be closed, she squinted, peeking just enough to get a general idea of the direction some had gone in John Bishop Park. Kelly couldn't see everyone without turning her head. She resisted the urge to do so to avoid being accused of cheating like last time. Kelly did manage to see where a few people had gone. Andy, a boy who lived down the street, ran behind the tree on her left. Skyla, the neighbor, was crouching at the base of the slide. Jeffrey, her little brother and youngest kid in their playgroup, was running around in circles complaining he couldn't find anywhere to hide like he always did. At 6, Jeffrey was only selected to be it as a last resort, or when he started crying, threatening to tell his and Kelly's parents that Kelly wasn't playing fair. No one, including Kelly, liked to hide with him because he couldn't keep quiet and he always whined if he got caught before he wanted to. Truth be told, he was a brat. And the only reason Kelly brought him to the park with her was that their parents made her. Reluctantly putting her resentment aside, Kelly closed her eyes and kept counting. Almost immediately, she stopped, interrupted by a blast of heavy metal music. She peeked again, glimpsing 2 teenagers in a blue van before resuming the game. 18 1,000, 19 1,000, 20 1,000. Ready or not, here I come. Kelly opened her eyes, and at the same time, she heard a scream. She looked around, but saw no one outside of their hiding place. Had she imagined the sound? Stepping away from the tree, she saw the blue van heading for the exit. Kelly made eye contact with the driver for a quick second. He smiled, and she smiled back. Then, to her shock, he laughed and gave her the finger as he peeled out of the parking lot and disappeared down the street. Confused by the driver's actions and slightly perturbed at the intrusion, Kelly stared after the van for a long moment. Boys could be so stupid. They were also unnecessarily annoying if she included her little brother in the assessment of males. Kelly was pleasantly surprised to see that Jeffrey had apparently found a hiding spot. She smiled. Perhaps her baby brother wasn't as stupid as he was annoying. With the park finally quiet again, Kelly repeated her charge. Ready or not, here I come. Kelly first ran in Andy's direction. He peeked around the tree and saw her coming. He took off toward the base, which was the tree from which Kelly had been counting. She was never going to catch him. Other kids ran toward the base as well, but Kelly was fast enough to tag Skyla as she came from behind the slide. You're it! Oh man, Skyla moaned. Together, Kelly and Skyla walked back to the base where everyone took a moment to catch their breath and talk about their hiding spots. Finally, Skyla asked, y'all ready to go again? The kids were off in a flash as Skyla began counting. As Kelly jogged away, she looked around for her brother. Hey, has anyone seen Jeffrey? No one paid any attention. They were all too busy running for safety. Kelly searched to no avail. There was no sign of him. She was so perplexed she didn't hear when Skyla had finished counting. Tag, you're it! Skyla shouted a few moments later, slapping her on the shoulder. Laughter erupted as other kids ran to the base, teasing Kelly for having been caught so quickly. Guys, I can't find my brother, she explained. He's probably still hiding somewhere, one of the boys said. Last time I saw him, he was by the parking lot. I bet he's behind one of the cars. Kelly ran in that direction. Other kids followed. He wasn't there. Let's check the shelter across the street, suggested Andy. He and a few others crossed Etna Road while Kelly stood paralyzed in the parking lot. Pretty soon, all the kids were scattered around the park in search of Jeffrey. Everyone was shouting his name. Their efforts were in vain. A pit forming in her stomach, Kelly ran the 3 blocks home to face the wrath of her parents who had warned her to keep an eye on him. Upon delivering the news that she couldn't find Jeffrey, her dad hopped in a car and sped out while her mom quickly called the Whitehall police. Soon, several of the neighbors, adults and kids alike, scanned the streets looking for her brother. Owners of cars that were left in the park for whatever reason were contacted and questioned. Hours of searching turned into days, and after a week, hope was fading. Officers interviewed each kid who was at the park that day, wanting to know every detail they could recall. Kelly told them about the van with the teenage boys, wondering if they were responsible for her brother's disappearance. She left out the part about the scream, afraid it might bring further resentment from her parents about her irresponsibility. Besides, she wasn't sure if she had really heard anything. She kept the detail to herself even after her brother's body was found in the wooded area of Whitehall Community Park, a mile or so from John Bishop Park. He'd been raped and strangled. 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000. Kelly abruptly awoke. She looked at the clock, 3:13 a.m. Sighing heavily, she reached to the nightstand for the 2 bottles she kept there. She opened the short plastic one, removed 2 pills, and popped them into her mouth. She opened the tall bottle and took a long gulp of the brown liquid, washing down the pills in an attempt to escape the nightmare from 20 years ago. The moonlight glow coming through the open blinds of her bedroom window shed enough light that she could read Psalm 23:4 inscribed on her wall. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. When Kelly was younger, her dad stenciled this verse for her after she'd had a series of bad dreams. Remember, God will always protect you, he would say. Whenever you wake up from a nightmare, I want this verse to be the first thing you see. Allow his word to comfort you. Well, that advice worked when she was a child before Jeffrey's murder, but now she was sure it was the 2 bottles and the liquor that really calmed her. That was from the Valley. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. Andrew Welsh-Huggins, an Associated Press reporter, is the author of the Andy Hayes Private Eye series, including the Nero Award-nominated Fatal Judgment. Andrew is also the editor of the anthology Columbus Noir, and his short fiction has appeared in publications including Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine, Mystery Weekly, and Mystery Tribune. Welcome, Andrew.
It's good to be here, Karen. Thanks so much for having us and for letting us read and talk about Columbus Noir. I'm going to read from my story in the collection called Going Places. I'm in the atrium, a late afternoon in early September, worrying for reasons I can't explain. It's the conclusion of lobbying day for the Association of Digital Marketing Professionals, something like that. My boss, the final speaker, relegated to the end thanks to his already full day of meetings with legislators, meetings with cabinet members, meetings with members of the National Press Corps writing the latest profile. The Honorable Bradley Pendleton, Governor of the great state of Ohio, a successful second termer with a reputation for bipartisanship that has people whispering Lincoln-esque as they tout his accomplishments. Factories buzzing again, state rivers and streams healthier than ever, reforms shrinking the prison population by the day. Little surprise he's on the short list of Veep candidates for the presidential election a mere 14 months away. After his speech, witty, warm, and above all brief, I stand beside him while a gaggle of State House reporters lob questions at him. What about the charter school bill? What about the gun purchase background check bill? What about the payday lending bill? Late afternoon sunlight filters through the atrium's floor-to-ceiling windows, striping the gathered lobbyists and other guests as they migrate post-event towards steaming pans of hors d'oeuvres, trays of vegetables, glass stands of cookies and brownies. Black-clad servers circulate with trays of complimentary Chardonnay and Pinot Noir from Ohio vineyards naturally, which boost their favorability for a State House event, if not their actual taste. Standing just behind Pendleton, I turn and eye the stuffed pigeons sitting high above the crowd in a small alcove over the entrance to the Senate Annex. The fixture a reminder of the days when the space we stand in was open to the elements, and the rain of bird shit so constant that umbrellas sat in canisters on either side to assist those making their way across. Perfect metaphor for this place, goes the punchline my boss has delivered often, and which always kills. His 5 minutes with the press corps concluded, the governor shifts toward the middle of the atrium and the line of people waiting to greet him. I shift with him, keeping an eye on the crowd, but not overly concerned about danger to my boss right at the moment, despite whatever it is that's worrying me. After all, the State House bristles with state troopers from top to bottom. I should know. I'm one of them. Amanda Purnell, she says, stepping forward next in line. They shake hands and she presses a business card into his palm. I really enjoyed your speech, but I wonder if you're aware of the broadband issues with, and here her voice lowers a bit as she leans forward, revealing a hint, just a hint of cleavage. Pendleton responds in kind, and I lose the gist of their conversation. Not that it matters. I've already caught the gleam in his eye. Now it's just a question of seeing whether he follows an all too familiar script. The signs are not good. Digital marketing appears to be largely a woman's game, to judge by those milling about the atrium, and attractive women at that. But even among these, Purnell stands out. Tall, raven-haired, dark designer glass frames, wearing a red ruffle sleeve sheath dress that stops just above the knees. In hindsight, this should have been a warning signal, since my routine-bound boss prefers a certain type, blonde, buxom, hippie, and never ever his height. Purnell is none of those things, starting with her ability to look Pendleton directly in the eyes. But she's a 10, no question, regardless of her type. I see what you mean, he says after a long minute, pulling himself up out of their conversation. Let's be in touch. I really appreciate that, Governor, she says, flashing a smile as she moves aside to permit the next well-wisher to step forward. I watch my boss, waiting to see how the scene concludes, selfishly, since the outcome will affect me directly. 99 times out of 100, the governor turns and hands me the latest business card, leaving it up to me to place it on the desk of the most appropriate aide, or not, depending on my read of the presenter. But not today. Today, as the buzz of a well-fed and well-lubricated crowd grows in the atrium, Pendleton slips Amanda Purnell's card into the left pocket of his suit coat jacket as he turns without missing a beat to greet the next woman in the line. The nagging feeling of something wrong fades slightly as the reality of the situation sinks in. In other words, here we go again. Before Purnell, here are the three that stood out over the years. The scheduler. 2 years out of Denison, back home after an obligatory policy stint in DC. To repeat, blonde to her shoulders, not natural, but not tardy either. Buxom, eyes up, my mantra whenever I spied her, and curvy, but in a gym after work kind of way. Her desk just around the corner from Pendleton's on the 31st floor of the Rife building. Rife rhymes with knife, at State and High across from the State House. To my surprise then, she showed up at an all-day Appalachian Economic Forum at Hocking College, our first March in office. During a break between morning meetings and Pendleton's lunchtime keynote, he signaled me to follow him through the convention hall to a room in the small attached hotel. I caught a glimpse of the scheduler sitting on the end of the bed as the door opened and closed, and that was that for the next several weeks. The professor. They met in a wood-paneled antechamber outside my boss's ceremonial State House office 2 years in. Brief, private introductions ahead of Pendleton's commissioning of a blue ribbon task force studying connections between school funding and urban academic performance. She was a much-published education policy expert, although ironically, what I recall them discussing in that moment was Mrs. Pendleton's love of hot yoga, an enthusiasm the professor apparently shared. Into his pocket went her business card. And there went my lunch breaks the next 6 months. The lawmaker. Impossible to say when they met, since both were in politics in the same party for years, but easy to say when it began. At that time, she was vice chair of the House Healthcare Committee, where in weekly meetings in the Harding hearing room, she grilled hospital executives hoping to water down price control bills. The week after the inauguration launching Pendleton's second four-year term, he held a Saturday afternoon Medicaid policy retreat at the governor's residence exactly 3.7 miles east in Bexley. Mrs. Pendleton, Beth, and the children conveniently away in Youngstown visiting her parents. After drinks and a concluding dinner, guests gathered in small groups in the library, the collection heavy on Ohio authors, for final conversations before drifting off into the evening. At the end of the night, I was leaning over a coffee table to retrieve an errant copy of Louis Bromfield's Pleasant Valley when I was interrupted by a cough. I looked up to catch the eye of my boss as he and the lawmaker drifted away themselves up the stairs to the private residence. I replaced the book on the shelf and positioned myself at the base of the staircase. In obvious ways, she was the riskiest of them all. Despite what you see on TV, it's hard as hell for two high-profile individuals to copulate secretly on a regular basis. More often than not, they ended up in her condo in Dublin, which helps some. But sometimes, talk about hazardous, they hooked up in the State House itself, giggling like teenagers going at it with mom and dad in the next room. Begging Pendleton to be careful, I entrusted him with a ring of spare keys to rooms people rarely went, rooms outside the web of security camera coverage. You can imagine my relief when term limits kicked in and she decided to return home to Cincinnati to take over her ailing father's law practice. A serious danger to my boss's reputation had passed. Until Amanda Purnell came along. I know what you're thinking. How was all this possible in the Me Too age, not to mention the era of smartphones and social media? I ask myself the same thing constantly. By my count, we were always one tit pick away from disaster. The short answer, I think, is that for all his faults, my boss was not a pig. He respected women deeply. He was the first Ohio governor to have a majority of female cabinet members. He never pressured anyone. It was guaranteed that when the business card went into his pocket instead of my hand, it was because of a mutual spark. He was Bill Clinton without the cigars and the fake flattery, Henry Hyde without the youthful indiscretions hypocrisy. As a result, his partners were both lovers and partisans. They knew the risk to the good government he represented if word of the liaisons leaked out. Of course, my boss knew this too and used it to his advantage when selecting paramours. With that kind of calculation at work, was it any surprise he was on the Veep shortlist? What are you staring at? I start and stand to attention. Nothing, ma'am. Bullshit, you were looking at me. Why? I apologize, Mrs. Pendleton. I didn't mean what? Nothing, ma'am. We're in the kitchen at the residence. I'm in my civvies, Rockports, chinos, button-down shirt, sports coat. The First Lady perched on a stool at the island in the middle, half-consumed slice of toast on a plate beside her, reading today's Columbus Dispatch. Back from this morning's hot yoga workout. Veep announcement soon, all eyes on Pendleton, screams the above-the-fold headline. You'd have to be blind to miss the tiny smile that crossed Beth's face when she saw the news. But that's not the reason I'd been staring at her. She stands and circles the island, a piece of paper in her hand. I keep my eyes trained on the clock on the wall, polished oak face in the shape of Ohio. Try my best to ignore the fit of her yoga tights, the press of her bosom through her green workout shirt, the sheen of perspiration on her brow, blonde hair pulled into a ponytail with a pink scrunchie. What is this, she says. Ma'am? This. She thrust the paper toward me. A printout of Pendleton's calendar, a document to rival a Spielberg daily shot list, nearly every 15-minute interval accounted for. She points at the entry for 10 a.m., the longest of the day at exactly 1 hour. It says WFD with an asterisk. I keep my eyes glued to the clock. It's 9:05 a.m. The Pendletons stair-step kids, son 11, daughter 9, daughter 7, already at school. The boss upstairs making calls, down soon. I believe that's an economic development meeting, short for workforce development. The single asterisk signifies the level of, I know what it means, ground level, barely in the door, not a big deal yet, but could be. I mean, who's it with and where? It's Upper Arlington. I'm not entirely sure who the principal is. You're not? Voice sharp as a school teacher's batting down a homework excuse. I shake my head. I regret the white lie, but what can I do? I know perfectly well that by 5 minutes after 10, my boss will be fucking Amanda Purnell on her Dakota Jackson bed beneath 300 thread count cotton sheets in a condo across the street from the Upper Arlington Public Library. He might even do it twice if he has time before his next event, a ribbon cutting at a state-funded opioid treatment center. Dissatisfied, she stalks back to her stool. Sometimes I wonder if you realize what's at stake here. She taps the dispatch, drawing her finger across the headline about her husband. I believe I do, Mrs. Pendleton. Would you please call me Beth? I've asked you 1,000 times. Yes, Beth, I say, almost unable to voice her name. That's better, barely, she says, throwing me the smallest of smiles, but bigger than the one triggered by the headline, which means a lot, given how madly I'm in love with her. Thanks. And I apologize for this noisy one who may have interrupted the reading. She's my office mate and can't go anywhere without me. Thanks again for having us, Karen.
Oh, thank you so much. What, so much intrigue, so many twists and turns, so unresolved. Everybody will have to buy the book. Andrew, if you would please tell us about the process of editing the collection and let that lead into a conversation.
Yeah, happy to. So Columbus Noir is one of many titles in a series published by Akashic Books. It's a Brooklyn-based publisher. They publish quite a lot of fiction and nonfiction, but one of the things they're known for are these series of noir mystery stories set in cities, states, around the country and around the world. I became interested in this having first read Pittsburgh Noir a number of years ago and just sort of tore through a bunch of them. One of the things I really like about this series is that while there are a number of volumes set in the cities that you might expect, Manhattan Noir, Boston Noir, LA Noir, and those are great volumes. But there's also a lot of noir, these titles that are set in the places in between. I mentioned Pittsburgh Noir. Some of my favorites are Providence Noir and Buffalo Noir.
Oh, wow.
And I just, over the years, thought it would be really great if we had a Columbus Noir. There had never been one set in Ohio, and I'm a big advocate of my adopted city. And I pitched this to Akashic Noir back in 2017. It took a little while, a little back and forth, but the project was accepted. Akashic Noir operates on an invitation-only process. They don't do submissions. So I was lucky that I got to reach out to some of the best writers, not just in Ohio, but in the country. And you're looking at two of them right here. And over about a year period of time, writers would submit their stories a little bit on a rolling basis as I invited more authors. And I had a standard threefold process when I edited the stories. The first time I would simply send the story to my Kindle and I would read it just straight through without taking notes of any kind, just read it like any story. The second time I would read it usually on my computer and I would take notes, but I wouldn't make any notes on the story itself. And then the third time through, I would do a little bit of editing in the story itself, make some suggestions, ask some questions. And then there was, give and take with the authors. I would send off the edits and they would respond. And that whole process with the 13 stories plus mine, that took about a year. So that was sort of the process of putting it together. One of the goals of mine was to really show both the breadth of writing prowess in Columbus, but also to showcase the city in Central Ohio. So if you're all familiar with Columbus, there's a lot of neighborhoods you're going to recognize. Kristen's story that she read from is set in Old Town East, which is a iconic neighborhood, just like she described, with big mansions on the east side. Mine is set in and around the Ohio State House, which is kind of a world in and of itself. Yolonda's is in Whitehall, a suburb just east of the city. But we have stories set in German Village, the all-brick neighborhood south of downtown. We have stories set in the Short North, which is that kind of funky, artsy area north of downtown. There's a story set in Clintonville, which is that older neighborhood north of Ohio State. There's also a story set at Ohio State. So I think the collection does really, it really gives you a good flavor of Columbus. If you aren't from the city and you don't know it, I hope it describes a place you might want to visit. And if you are from here, I hope it teaches you a little bit about the place where you live. So that's sort of, that's how Columbus Noir came about and how I put it together. I might just, from here, maybe start with Yolonda. And Yolonda, we've talked about this a lot before, but can you remind people why you chose Whitehall as where you wanted to set it, and then just kind of what your process was as you went about writing The Valley?
Well, I chose Whitehall because I lived there for 13 years. I no longer live in Whitehall, but I was living there at the time where Andrew and I remember this differently. I say I was voluntold to participate in this project, and because initially he came to me and asked me, and I was like, I don't think this is something for me. And he came back and was like, yeah, I think it is. And so we had a discussion, and even though it stretched me, took me outside of my comfort zone, it was truly an honor and blessing to write. My biggest concern with writing the story or writing any kind of noir story, because it's not something that I had ever done, is that I felt like I wouldn't be able to be authentic in keeping my voice. And, talking with Andrew and even speaking with my agent, just both of them encouraging me to be me, write the story and just be who I am. So my story takes place in, the kidnapping happens in John Bishop Park. And it's a combination, it's nothing like that to my knowledge has ever happened in Whitehall. It's just a combination of me having creativity and me watching true crime all the time, and just kind of blending the what ifs and coming up with something.
I should note before we go on, one thing I forgot to mention is that these stories are meant to be in the noir style, which is sort of a subgenre of mystery writing, and it's sometimes a misunderstood genre. People hear noir and they automatically think, well, these are dark, they're violent, there's a lot of profanity, and you can have all those things in a noir story, but essentially noir is typically characterized by a character, usually just an ordinary person, who reaches a little bit too far for something that probably is out of their reach for a good reason. And bad things typically happen as a result. The crime novelist Laura Lippman has this great line. She says, noir is when a dreamer becomes a schemer. And so a lot of the stories in Columbus Noir and in the Akashic Noir collections tend to be in that noir genre. Not all of them are, and nor do they really all have to be, but that's just sort of a hallmark of this. And I would have to say, Yolonda's story is a fantastic example of how you can have a noir story and deal with characters who find themselves outside of where they probably should be. I'm not sure there's a single swear word in Yolonda's story, but it's sure a noir story from head to foot. So I'm so happy that it's in the collection. Kristen, tell us about Old Town East as the setting for Gun People, and obviously you wrote outside of your series for this. Talk a little bit about your process.
So the Old Town East is a neighborhood that I really love. I lived there for a number of years. I don't live there anymore, but it's a really interesting place to look at architecturally. And there are just, a lot of different types of people who live there. And back in the days when I did live there, I would sort of get these comments from people that, coworkers. They would kind of go like, isn't that a bad neighborhood? And it's kind of like, it's like ridiculous, because any neighborhood can be a bad neighborhood. It doesn't really matter. Like, people would say that because, it's on the edge of downtown. It's a historically Black neighborhood. So people get this idea of like, oh, it's dangerous, which the detail in the story of Anya always feeling safe in the neighborhood is very much my experience. I never felt unsafe when I was living in Old Town at all. I had my car broken into once, but I also had my car broken into multiple times when I lived in Upper Arlington, which is a nice neighborhood. So, it's just like, this is one of those things. But what I wanted to do was write about this idea of, people coming to this so-called bad neighborhood, but they're bringing their problems with them. So really, it's this idea of there goes the neighborhood. It's because these gentrifiers have come in with their personal drama that is sort of creating the conflict, nothing to do with the actual neighborhood itself. And that was really kind of fun to explore, with the idea of, Anya and her husband have moved to Old Town to renovate this old house. And obviously they're not in the best place anyway, because these things wouldn't have happened if their marriage was completely happy. But it's like the saying, wherever you go, there you are. Like, Anya is going to be the kind of person she is no matter what neighborhood she lives in. And she has brought that kind of drama with her. But my other sort of connection to Old Town is that in the mystery series that I write, the Roxane Weary private investigator series, Roxane also lives in Old Town. So a lot of the stories take place across the city and in other areas around Central Ohio, but her home base is there in Old Town East. So it's definitely a place that I have always really enjoyed writing about.
Yeah, thank you. Kristen, just real briefly, what is your take on the concept of noir, and how do you define it as you read and write?
I really do like that Laura Lippman definition about dreamers and schemers, but I also kind of think it's noir stories are about people who make increasingly bad decisions. Like they make one bad choice, and at every moment and opportunity they have to sort of turn it around, they turn the wrong way. They keep making the wrong choice. And so that's kind of how they get into these really desperate, ugly situations.
Yeah, a friend of mine who read Columbus Noir said that she summed it up by saying every story she read, she found herself saying, "No, don't do it. No, don't do it. No,
Yeah.
Don't do it."
That's like the motto of a noir story.
Yes, exactly. Yolanda, you and I think are both Columbus transplants. Is that right?
Yes, I didn't grow up here.
Yeah.
I grew up in Sandusky, Ohio, or some people just call it Cedar Point.
Yeah. And I've been in Ohio for a long time. And in fact, I think as some people hopefully tuning in here know, I actually worked at the late great Vindicator in Youngstown in the 1990s. But I grew up in Western New York State. And anyway, Yolanda, what do you think about Columbus as a place to set crime fiction? You've obviously had the Protective Detective series here, and you have your story here. What is it about this place that made you think about putting mystery fiction here?
Writing what was familiar, I think. So if we take it back to my very first story, Soul Matters, it was actually supposed to take place in Chicago. I took several trips to Chicago to research the city and do a bunch of stuff. And then as I started writing, I was like, I want the story to take place in Columbus. And so when we get to the Protective Detective series, there are some crossover characters. So it had to take place here because those characters, they couldn't mysteriously automatically come from Chicago when I've written about them previously living here. And so it just kind of naturally evolved that way.
You think Columbus is it a good town, a bad town? What do you think?
No, I actually think it's very good for, especially to be a major city. I don't think that we have the degree of crime that some other major cities have. So I actually think Columbus it's a good place to raise a family. You still have the big city life, so to speak, but not necessarily all the big city problems.
Kristen, I still remember at the launch of your first book, someone saying how much they liked it, but I remember him saying something like, "But Kristen, why Columbus?"
Yeah.
Can you talk about? I mean, you very much are a Columbus voice. Columbus is a voice in your stories, and clearly you've wanted to set them the fore here. Can you talk about that?
Well, I think part of it is I like writing about a city that I live in. It's fun to write about places you don't live, but it's not as much fun. And if you want to figure out the exact perfect seedy alley to set a scene, you can just go drive there and see if it's right, see if the mood is right. But I think that people who aren't from here don't necessarily understand that Columbus is a real city. It's not one of those Ohio cities. I mean, Columbus is a real city. It's a major city. It's full of interesting juxtapositions. I think that it's different from a lot of places because you can be in the center of downtown and drive for 30 minutes and you're completely outside the city and standing in cornfields. Whereas in a city like Chicago, if you drive for 30 minutes from the center of the city, you're still very much in Chicago. So, here in Columbus, we have that interesting tension between sort of urban and rural life, red versus blue, and just lots of interesting places that you can kind of explore storytelling. And plus, I've lived here for a long time and I just like it. So I think it's a great place to live in and to write about.
Yeah, I would say I agree with everything there. And, when I moved here in 1998, and it took me probably, my first mystery novel set in Columbus wasn't published until 2014. So it took me a while to feel like I understood and felt comfortable enough to write about Columbus. But I think there's just so much here. I mean, if you just start with the fact that it's the state capital, and then there's just so much happening in Columbus now between the growth in the high-tech industry, we've really become a hub for several immigrant groups. And I think that's really enlivening the city in positive ways. And then someplace along the line, we somehow became a hub of the opioid and then heroin trade. And, that obviously is not a positive development, but, for crime fiction, it provides lots of opportunities. So I do think it's, I'm always amazed when people still ask about this. And, you try not to point out to them too hard that, we are the 14th largest city in the United States. I mean, we're bigger than a lot of cities you may have heard of. And part of it, I think, unfortunately, is something as silly as we've lacked those big major league sports teams. And, Cleveland and Cincinnati, you think of the NFL teams and the baseball teams. But I think I just think as Columbus, Columbus is growing while those other cities aren't really growing. I mean, there's exciting things happening in Cincinnati and Cleveland, but Columbus is the place where everybody's flocking to, and I think that makes it a really good place to write about bad things happening. Kristen, what's coming up next for you?
So I'm currently working on a mystery novel that is not part of my series. It's a standalone mystery, still set in the sort of central Ohio area, but it features the ultimate Midwestern site, which is a corn maze. So I'm very excited about that.
Great.
And how about you, Yolanda? You're always busy.
Yes, well, I am working on actually a devotional, 52-week devotional. I have contributors, so that will be released next year, well, the end of this year. And then also working on a cozy mystery series. So I have more writing time available now that I'm officially done with the classwork portion of my doctoral program. So
That's great. Now, will that cozy series be set? Will that be set here?
it's actually in a fictitious town.
Okay. Very nice.
How about you, Andrew? What are you working on?
I'm working these days on, well, my seventh Mandy Hayes book, that comes out in June, but that's sort of locked and loaded. I've been writing a fair amount of short fiction, but then my main, other than my reporting, the main thing I'm working on is a true crime book about a band of burglars from the Boston area who carried out a break-in at a Brinks facility in Columbus in 2009 and nearly got away with $100 million. And the leader of that gang is a very colorful character who led this gang really for decades and robbed a lot of places all over New England. And anyway, that's what I'm focusing on right now. I don't have much news about publication yet or anything, but that's definitely occupying my time.
That sounds so interesting. Well, I want to thank you all for this delightful evening and all best wishes on this book and your next endeavors. I'm just so grateful that you add your voices to our series. So thank you again.